Hello and welcome to this week's Close-Up Foundation discussion from the world's first interactive museum of news, the Newseum, here in Arlington, Virginia. I'm John Molesky. Today, with the help of high school students from around the country, we're going to take a look at a unique publication in the world of journalism through the eyes of one of its veteran reporters and editors. Peter Greer is the Washington editor for the Christian Science Monitor. The newspaper was founded in 1908 by Mary Baker Eddy, founder of the Christian Science Church. And in the paper's very first editorial, Mrs. Eddy said the paper's purpose is to injure no man, but to bless all mankind. The Monitor has been honored with hundreds of awards, including 6 Pulitzer Prizes. Mr. Greer has reported from Washington since 1979. And prior to his present position, he was the Monitor's chief diplomatic writer and has served as Pentagon correspondent and general assignment writer. Today he runs the Monitor's Washington, D.C. bureau, and he is the co-winner of the Society of Professional Journalists National Reporting Award. Mr. Greer, welcome to Close Up at the Newseum.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Let me ask you about that first editorial that Miss Eddy wrote, and what is the message there? What is the mission of the Christian Science Monitor?
Well, that's a good way of putting it. When the newspaper was begun in 1908, that was a period of time when newspapers were very scandalous. You know, that's the period from which the term yellow journalism dates, because many of them were actually printed on yellow paper. The church felt that it would be a missionary activity to publish a completely straight, serious newspaper. Since then, as more other newspapers have of course, come along to that same point of view, we've tended to move into other areas. We do a lot of analysis, try and explain meaning to stories, and we're still one of the most globally oriented newspapers that you can buy in America. For a small newspaper, we maintain many foreign correspondents, and we have bureaus all across the country as well.
Ironic, you started off as a solution to yellow journalism. Now the tabloid format is what's most associated with that type of tabloid journalism. You know, something like the New York Post, just the format alone.
That's true. Of course, you're referring to the fact that we're a tabloid size now. But of course, it makes it easier to read on the subway, and the smaller photos reproduce so nicely anyway.
Yeah. Everybody's doing that. I guess the Washington Post just shrunk recently. But how is your paper different from, say, the Washington Post, the Washington Times, the Wall Street Journal? Is there an editorial difference that a reader can pick up on easily?
Well, we like to think that, of course, we have no point of view at all. Most newspapers like to feel that as well. We like to feel that we do that a little better than other people, that we're more neutral, say. But I think that you have to go back to the bless all mankind aspect of it, in which we try to present solution-oriented journalism, for instance. We don't, we are not reportable to anyone who's looking for profits, or at least not large profits. So we don't have to have celebrity-driven coverage. We don't have to have things that pander or scandalize. And we had a phrase in the newsroom that was no OJ. You know, during the OJ trial, we carried 3 or 4 stories about it, and that's about all. So it is, of course, a balance to try and be both entertaining and interesting and serious at the same time.
What about the current situation with the White House and the special prosecutor and Ms. Lewinsky? How is this Christian Science Monitor addressing that as an example of how you would treat that type of story?
Oh, that's a very good question. Do you have another one? We cover it, of course, relatively extensively, because it is both, it's a serious subject. I mean, there are very serious things at stake. We would try to do aspects of it that perhaps would be illuminating to people in and of themselves. And for instance, the most recent story I did on it was how there are so many parallels with this scandal, with Watergate in a way, and in fact much of it depends on Watergate, in the sense that the independent counsel came out of that, and the power of the independent counsel. So that in a way it's like the second half of something Richard Nixon started.
Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get started as a journalist?
Well, it was a place I could get a job, so that's how I started. Actually, I began, I used to teach tennis when I was in high school, and I taught tennis to the local arts editor, the local paper, a paper in Michigan called the Birmingham Eccentric. And we got to talking, and eventually she hired me to be a stringer, which is where you do, you get paid piece by piece. And I enjoyed it. I kind of went from there. At the time, then, the Eccentric was bought by a newspaper called The Observer, and we all hoped it would become the Eccentric Observer. but they switched it around. It was the Observer Eccentric instead.
Interesting name for a newspaper, the Eccentric. What does it indicate? A sense of humor on the part of the owners?
Well, I guess, you know, I don't know, so many of those names go back many years, as you can see here in the museum itself. And actually, I'm a fan also of the slogans, you know, that they have underneath the
masthead.
The masthead. We have what I believe one of the best slogans in America for our paper, and that is, it's first the grain, then the ear, then the full grain in the ear. I have no idea what that means, which is kind of why I like it.
But just fun.
Right.
And then how did you become associated with the Christian Science Monitor? Yours sounds like the classic story of someone who has worked his way up from the lowest levels.
That's true. I actually began as an intern at the Christian Science Monitor my junior year in college, and then came back after I graduated and got a full-time job, and was moved to Washington at a relatively young age, and now I've been here since the last time a Democrat was president, is the way I put it.
Okay, let's find out what you have on your minds. Let's go to our first question.
Hello, Mr. Greer. My name is Michael Loomis. I'm from Ohio. My question is, obviously, when the paper started, it had close ties with the church that it was sort of named after. How close are those ties now? Do you still follow those same kind of lines? Because while reading the paper, we saw very, very unbiased, and we were wondering, is that just because you guys strayed away from the Christian aspect of it, or is that just because you wanted a purely unbiased paper?
Well, first of all, it is owned by the Christian Science Church, wholly and completely. The board of directors does look at our editorials every day. So it is a religious paper in that sense. But from an editorial point of view, it is not a religious paper. It's a straight newspaper. The only, well, there are two connections in that sense. One is there is one religion article every day located in the back of the paper on what we call the home forum page. And the other is that to a certain extent, the values of the church tend to infuse the news choices as well. That's a kind of more abstract way of putting it, but it really is true.
Thank you.
Are you a Christian Scientist?
Yes, I am.
Were you
I am.
before you came to the paper?
Yes, yes. I was raised in the church, but many of the staff are not. You don't have to be to work for the paper. At least you didn't have to be the last time I looked. And many of our most famous and dedicated correspondents have not been.
Hi.
In studying the newspaper,
Hi, could you tell us who you are, please?
oh, I'm Philip Jones from Indianapolis, Indiana.
Thanks, Philip.
In studying the newspaper at school, I've found it's come to my attention that the money for a newspaper is generated by advertisements. In reading your paper, I didn't find very many advertisements at all. And I was just curious as to where your paper gets its finance.
Well, if you have any advertising to give, first of all, we'll be glad to take it. So that's not a problem. You're right that the economics of newspapers depends very crucially on advertising pitch to a local audience. Because we don't really have a local audience, we don't get a lot of that. The church pays for the paper partly out of its own pocket. We don't make money. We, in fact, lose a relatively substantial sum of money and do most years. And it's not an inexpensive newspaper. We're a little more expensive to buy, say, than the Post. So in that sense, the economics are a little tough for us, but fortunately the church views it as a very positive activity for the country and indeed for the world.
What is the current price of an issue?
Oh, geez, of course, I never have
You
to
don't have
buy
to
it,
buy
so
yours.
I wouldn't
Wait,
know.
somebody has one in the...
It's
75 cents.
75
yeah,
cents.
but it costs $150 or something to subscribe a year. That's relatively expensive.
Right, right. Okay, now we're going to take our first call from Sanborn Regional High School in Kingston, New Hampshire. They join us with a question. Go ahead, please.
Hi, my name is Julie Marshall from Sanborn in Kingston, New Hampshire.
Just a second. I think we're getting a little bit of feedback. We might ask you to start again.
Okay, one more time.
There you go. That
Hi,
sounds better.
Julie Marshall from Sanborn in Kingston, New Hampshire. For the first question, I'd like to ask what exactly a chief bureau is and what are the duties that correspond with the job.
What's your job? Your job description? What is a
job,
bureau chief?
Well, I have how many? 7 or 8 reporters under me, and my job every day is to basically shape and assign them on the various stories that they do, and also edit the stories that they produce before we send them to our home office in Boston. And unfortunately, I have to do a lot of writing still myself, so I'm kind of like a player coach in that sense. And I produce about 100 newspaper stories a year as well.
How about actual reporting? Do you do any of that in your new position?
Oh, fortunately, of course, you know, as you get older, you get more pundocratic, so there's less and less reporting. I don't get to go out as much as I used to. But, you know, every newspaper story requires a number of phone calls, if nothing else. So, yeah, I don't get to go out as much as I used to, though, which is a shame.
Hi, go ahead, please.
Hello, I'm Marie Price from Gary, Indiana. And I was wondering, you know, as you said that you guys lose more money than you actually make. So do you find yourself compelled to do your news like the regular newspapers so that you could attract more buyers so that you could actually work at a profit?
Or are you determined to still lose money? Is that the other side of the question?
Yes, well, of course, that's a question that goes right to the heart of the economics of my paper. We think we're a very interesting paper to read, and we do everything we can to attract readers. And that our big problem is that not enough people have just never picked it up in the first place. You know, it's a kind of market in which certain types of people tend to read us. People who are interested in foreign news for work or personally. People who live in places where they can't get a really good newspaper except by mail. You know, other than that, I don't really know how to answer your question. I'd love to have more readers, and if you'd like to join them, I'd be perfectly happy.
Okay, I was really basing my question on the fact that, you know, when you read newspapers like the Washington Post and in my city, the Post Tribune, we have, I should say, the Kenneth Starr case, the Monica Lewinsky trial, you know, everything with that, you know, it's making front page news. And we look at the news coverage, you know, those are the main topics that go on the front page, and especially these dealings with Iraq. But when we read your paper, you know, you're dealing with the topics that actually touch home, that would affect us in a more personal level. And, you know, they say that a lot of people are not really interested in the things that really affect them, but more so in what affects other people, and really, I had to say, being nosy and into everyone else's business. So, you know, do you feel compelled to, you know, comply to what America wants?
No, I think I understand what you're saying. Well, first of all, you know, I do have a question for you. How interested are you in the Lewinsky case?
Actually, I'm not interested, because I feel that's the president's business.
Because actually I had this discussion with my editor earlier today. We would tend to look on that right now as an opportunity. We figure that a lot of other people will focus a huge amount of their resources on that. And we're not a big newspaper. We can't really compete with the Washington Post in that sense. So we're going to go somewhere else. We'll still do some stories on that to cover the highlights of it, but we'll try and focus on other things. Like I don't know if the issue you had a story we did on, for instance, how many high schools now are starting to kick you off extracurricular activities if you smoke or drink, you know, at home, if they catch you at home. It's like they're extending their kind of their oversight into your home, and that's something that would probably, you know, concern a lot of the people here, at least a little more than the Monica Lewinsky case.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Hi.
Hi, my name is Brandon Kivett. I'm from Indianapolis, Indiana. And my question for you, Mr. Greer, is you said that you had worked in the newsroom, and to the previous question that you don't go for the big name stories. But I was wondering, where do you get your stories? I mean, the majority of them, because in a recent paper, you had a lot of stories of different countries and 3 different articles on Israel and a large portion of the page dedicated to bees.
Did you like the bee story, though?
I thought it was a bit pointless, but I thought you could have focused more towards like the main point of the story, which was how they were being killed by pesticides instead of the life habits of the bees.
So what did you think about the foreign stories?
Foreign stories, I thought they were, you know, pretty good for what they were, but I think a few less of them would be, you know, more practical and some more things closer to home.
Sounds like an American point of view on foreign coverage. Let me ask you, what is your local newspaper, or the paper you read on a daily basis?
Is the Indianapolis Star.
Okay.
Well, the prosaic answer to your question is often we tend to group our foreign stories, for instance. So if the correspondent in Israel has a particular story, they'll have another one maybe that's related to that and do like an Israel package. This week we've been doing a lot of stories about Indonesia, which you probably haven't read a lot about in your local paper, because Indonesia is having some particularly important things happen there this week. So it tends to hop from country to country.
Not interested in the lifestyles of bees,
As
are
the
you?
bees, that's features. I don't know. I don't handle features, so I can't help you on that one. Just like I always say, I can't defend TV either.
Okay, we're going to go back to Sanborn Regional High School. Before you ask your question, there are a few steps we need you to take, and that is to turn your volume down completely. If you have a mute button, you can use that. If not, just have someone manning the volume. Whenever you speak, the volume needs to be down. Then when you get your answer, you can turn the volume back up. Go ahead, please.
Hi, this is Josh McGahee from Sanborn Regional High School. My question is, since you were in Cuba, how have the politics with Cuba changed over the years, and what is the significance of the Pope's visit?
Okay, thanks, Josh. Good technical work there.
Well, first of all, of course, you have happened to cross an exaggeration in my resume. I have indeed been to Cuba, but I've been to the part of Cuba that's America, which is there is an American military base on the ground on the Cuban mainland. It has been since before Castro took over. I've been there a number of times when I was a Pentagon correspondent. And as to how the politics have changed since then, of course, they have changed in a way very little because Castro himself is, of course, one of the last great dictators in the world. As to whether the people on the street are growing more restive for a little more economic freedom, that I couldn't say. Certainly their economy is opening up a little bit more than it used to be. And I'm sorry, I forgot the second half of your question already.
Josh, go ahead. What was the second part of your question, please?
What is the significance of the Pope's visit to Cuba?
Thanks.
The significance of the Pope's visit to Cuba, well, on the one hand, it gives Fidel something of a touch of legitimacy. You know, he's seen welcoming the Pope as an equal, and on an international scale, it kind of accepts him even more into kind of the world club of leaders, so to speak. On the other hand, the Pope goes where his followers are, and that's a very small price for him. He would feel that would be a very small price to pay for both rallying the faithful and carrying his message of human rights there. So in that sense, it was surely a positive development.
In comparing the Monitor to other newspapers, more or less foreign correspondents?
Well, we have fewer foreign correspondents, say, than the New York Times, but of course our resources are very small compared to the New York Times.
What about compared to a paper of equal resources?
Most papers of equal resources would have no foreign correspondence whatsoever. Very few American newspapers even really have foreign correspondence anymore, and we maintain them all across the world.
Hi, go ahead, please.
Hi, I'm Jed LaRoche from Blair, Ohio, and from the view of the Christian Science Monitor, do you feel that public officials' lives should be in the paper or advertised?
Let me think about that one for a second and get back to you. Should their lives be in the paper?
What are your editorial guidelines in covering the private lives of politicians?
Their behavior that reflects on their activity or their ability to carry out their official duties is fair game. Beyond that, I wouldn't think that it really is a lot of the journalism's business. But of course, that's the answer many newspapers will give you. The fact of the matter is they just don't stick to it.
What's your opinion on that? Do you agree generally with those guidelines, or do you have some different opinion on whether it's fair game or not?
I feel that if they're public officials, then they should act proper, like where they're at and what they do. But like, I don't feel like if they do something that's wrong to some people, that it should be advertised to everybody. So.
Okay. Hi, go ahead, please.
Okay, my name's Monica Rothel from Anderson, Indiana, and my question was, being a Christian paper, do you get any complaints from your readers about stories maybe not representing the Christian religion or contradicting the Christian religion?
Yes. The answer to that is when we do something that our readers, we have very involved readers, when we do something that they don't like, I certainly hear about it. Now, you have to remember that actually only a relatively small portion of our membership are of our readership are members of the Christian Science Church. Many of them are people who work in banking, say, and need foreign news for work or something like that. So that's only one part of our readership that would react that way.
Is there any concentration of readership? We can assume, for instance, that the Wall Street Journal is read by a lot of people in financial industry. Can you make any assumptions about your demographics? Are there concentrations of people who are followers of your newspaper?
Well, we have geographical concentrations, for instance. We have
You mentioned the rural.
a concentration in Washington, a concentration in California, for instance, and Boston, where it's based. Those are and Texas and Florida.
Why is that? Why those areas?
Why those areas? Well, Washington would be people who would be after it for work, as would New York be.
Newshound
Boston
towns.
would be kind of a combination of the two, both the universities and the fact that it's where the church itself is based. California is because that's where, I would imagine, because where there are many church members in California.
Sanborn Regional High School, we're back to you for another question. Go ahead, please.
Hi, this is Katrina from Sanborn, and the question is, how have your travels to Saudi Arabia, West Texas, and Kazakhstan influenced your writing?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
How your various travels have influenced your writing. And she mentioned some
Oh,
domestic
yes,
travel and
that's
some
right.
international travel.
Yes. Well, you know, when you look back on it, of all the stories I've done over the years, when you get to travel overseas are the ones you remember the most. You remember the travel. And I was in the Middle East for a period of time during and around the Persian Gulf War, and it was very interesting, of course, to see, it sounds trite, but how different the societies were, how differently they treat women, say. I was, for instance, walking downtown relatively late one night with a couple of other reporters looking for jewelry to buy our wives, and we started. A man with a cane came up. This was in Dhahran. Started tapping us on the ankle, and it turned out would run into a part of the a part of the shopping area that was reserved exclusively for women at that time, and so they escorted us out. They were very nice about it, but it would just, you know, it'd be like if they had the second floor of the mall down by Macy's is reserved purely for women from 6 to 9 on Sunday. I mean, it was kind of a different experience.
And how does, and following up on the question from the student in Sanborn, is there any way that you could tell how that might have had an impact on the way you write?
Oh, you know, that obviously everything you learn has an impact on the way you write. If that makes me more sensitive or less sensitive to certain things, I guess you'd have to read it and find out. I'm sorry, that's not a very good answer, but.
Speaking of your travels, I read in your biography, in your bio, that you were recruited by the KGB. Could you tell us about that?
Yes, and in fact, they turned me, and I am an agent of the Russian government. No.
Did you know your bosses have sort of gone out of business?
I was on a trip to what was then, well, what is still Kazakhstan, which was then part of the Soviet Union, is now a country in and of itself. And I was traveling with a group, actually, it wasn't strictly for journalism. I was traveling with a group of other people about my age. They called it kind of a yuppie exchange, so to speak, and we were meeting with like-minded people from the Soviet Union.
Got a picture on the, we're going to put a picture up on the screen, I guess, of when you were in Kazakhstan.
Yes. And one of them was a KGB agent assigned to watch all over us. We knew that would be the case. And so late one night, we were having a party in a hotel room, and he dragged me, and he took me by the arm and he dragged me into the hotel bathroom, and he locked the door and turned on all the water. And he looks at me and he goes, "You know, I can be of help to you if you get in trouble in my country. Perhaps you have documents you would like to send us." And fortunately, it was what they call a cold pitch, which is he wasn't really that serious about it. He just kind of wanted to get away and have a place to drink alone. So I just sat there, and he kind of killed off the vodka bottle, and gradually he fell asleep.
Sounds like he was supposed to do that to you, I think.
Yes, but it didn't work for me, and so so I got out. The next day I saw him, and it was we were outside, and it was a little warm, and I said, Vasily, or whatever his name was, "Take off your coat, it's warm." And he says, "I cannot, it would expose my gun." So,
well, a little intimidation.
Fortunately, actually later, oddly enough, this fellow is now a member of the Russian parliament. as I've heard later from one of our Moscow correspondents, and who has run into him, and he's a member of the Russian parliament under the name I knew him by, but our government told me that's not his real name, so I don't know, I don't know what's going on there.
Interesting. A lot of work to be done, I guess, in the emerging democracy. Hi, go ahead, please.
My name is Alex Timms. I'm from Richland High School in Richland, Mississippi. And with your newspaper being tabloid size and being called the Christian Science Monitor, does that affect the production and selling of your paper, and why?
Well, obviously it does affect the production and selling. For one thing, we're delivered by the mail, and so it makes it a little easier to send it through the mail. It's a little smaller. It uses less newsprint, and we were one of the first newspapers to go to all-color production in the United States, and the tabloid size has made that very easy to get good reproduction. And I don't know if you noticed, I think even today, the look of the paper, the quality of the reproduction of the typefaces and the quality of the reproduction of the photographs is really outstanding compared to a lot of color newspapers.
I guess whether the owner is a church or an individual or some multimedia conglomerate, always the question comes up about how tight those lines are drawn, or how distinctly those lines are drawn between editorial and ownership. What is your opinion? You mentioned that there are people on all the editorials go by a board, a church board. How have the owners done in keeping their noses clean from butting into the editorial activities of the paper?
I feel I have had no real interference from the board in my entire career. And, as you said, the other newspapers would have similar arrangements with their own, say, board of directors. Catherine Graham would read, say, the editorials in the Post and would have some say on that if she didn't like that. So it's really not an unusual arrangement at all.
So you've never had an uncomfortable moment where you're looking over your shoulder, worrying if a story would pass muster?
No, I mean, not from the board. Of course, from my own editor, maybe, occasionally, but not from the board.
Okay. Hi.
Hi, my name is Isabel, and I'm from San Francisco, California. And looking at your newspaper of March 10th, we noticed as a class that your newspaper focuses a lot on morale rather than late-breaking news. Would you say that that's an accurate statement to make?
Yes, on
morale.
Morals? Yes, that would be the case. I can tell you the reason for that, if you'd like to know.
Okay.
Which is twofold. One is, of course, that's kind of the mission of the paper, which is try and provide you an overall context and an overall meaning for what goes on in the world. That's the good news. The bad news is because we have really early deadlines. So it's tough for us to get breaking news in.
So would you then say that you're keeping many Christians ignorant to other issues going on in the United States?
That's a very, very good way of phrasing that question, and you could become a journalist for doing that.
Come on down.
Come on down. I wouldn't say that the purpose of that is to keep Christians around the world ignorant. I think we produce the best newspaper we can under the circumstances.
Okay, we're back to Sanborn Regional High School for your next question. Go ahead, please.
Hi, my name's Lance, and I'm from Sanborn Regional High School.
Hi, Lance.
Mr. Greer, I was wondering, how do you verify the accuracy of the information you print?
Well, we try, of course, to print to be as accurate as we possibly can when printing information. Verifying it, let's put it this way. Newspaper stories go through various layers of checking before they're printed. First, of course, the reporter writes it, and it's that person's best knowledge. Then an editor will read that story very closely before it's printed, changing it around for reading, for style purposes, for accuracy. So that's another level. And then at least one and probably two senior editors will also go through that story to make sure it comports with their knowledge as well. Now, of course, with all that, mistakes can still slip through in every newspaper. So I wouldn't say that we're perfect. For instance, I once misspelled two different people's names wrong in a story. That's one of the worst things I ever did. But it happens everywhere. I noticed the New York Times the other day ran a story about baseball on their front page because Rupert Murdoch's going to buy the Dodgers. And they had a little box that had where all the teams are in, with what division and what league. And it was all wrong. You know, obviously the person who'd edited that box had never follows baseball and didn't know that the Detroit Tigers aren't in the American League East anymore. So, you know, newspapers are not perfect.
Hi, go ahead, please.
Hello, my name is Elena Williams, and I'm from Gary, Indiana. And I wanted to ask my question, since this is a Christian newspaper, did you get any negative feedback from other religions?
No, we don't. We don't tend to get negative feedback from other religions.
Because I just want to know if anyone got offended, because I'm personally Baptist. I didn't get offended by the newspaper, but people that don't have a religion at all, did they get offended in some way?
Well, you know, many marketing consultants have told us that the word Christian in the headline depresses our sales, and we could perhaps have a more wide circulation if we just called it, you know, the Monitor or something like that. But that's not the mission. That's not the mission of the newspaper. The newspaper is owned by the Christian Science Church, and it will reflect that. Again, though, it's not necessarily addressed to a religious audience per se, so we don't tend to run into that problem.
Probably gain some pointers for the transparency of the title, though. People,
yes.
You're not afraid to put your name on there and know who it owns it.
No.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Maggie Jonas. I'm from Minnesota. I kind of got some conflicting statements for you. Earlier on the show, you said that your newspaper tried very hard to be unbiased and stuff and to give straightforward stories. But you also said that the topics of your stories were influenced by the fact that you were owned by the Christian Science Church. Do you think that by not reporting some stories, you are in fact a biased newspaper?
So it's decided
what
is
again
news
another
and bias.
person who's like bucking for Sam Donaldson's job. And I'll pretend that I'm Clinton, and I would say the way you do that. Well, you know, I reject the second premise of that question, which is.
Well, I'm not trying to offend you anyway. I was just curious if you thought that.
Let's get some helicopter sound effects, and you can shout your question over the.
You know, we like to think we are an unbiased newspaper. When I'm not sure I would have said exactly that because we're owned by the Christian Science Church that that determines what topics we pick. The church has. You know, when the church established the newspaper, it had certain missionary reasons in mind for doing so, obviously, and that is to provide fair and unbiased coverage. That is what would inform our choice of story. I mean, if you think that makes us biased, then, you know,
well, you know, I guess
would argue with that.
The question it might raise is what is unbiased if. You're suggesting that just the news judgment of what is news, what gets the space.
I mean, by excluding
how can you cover everything? I guess is
by
what
excluding certain stories, you know, that could be considered big. Don't you think that by not reporting those, you know, it's kind of, I mean.
Oh no, yeah, I see what you mean. I mean, every newspaper every day has to make many, many little decisions, which one way or the other can fall on a line that some people would call biased or not.
Yeah. It's an interesting question you ask, how you
and
define
that's
bias.
just part of the business. That's true. How do you define bias? It's very difficult to do. We do the best we can every day.
We're going to go back to New Hampshire for another question. Go ahead, please. Sanborn, you're on the air.
Hi, my name is Melanie Sullivan, and I was wondering, other than the KGB incident, what other interesting experiences have you encountered reporting in foreign nations?
Other interesting experiences. Well, I was arrested at the airport in Saudi Arabia because I had the wrong kind of book. I had a book about Saudi Arabia, which they don't like to let into the country, and I forgot to ditch it at the stopover in London. And stupidly, I had it in my bag when I arrived, and so they found it and kind of dragged me into a little police room for a couple of hours. Actually, arrested, maybe puts it too strongly. What else? Well, I had when I was in Kazakhstan, I had to eat horse fat salami, which was pretty much the most
Hope
gruesome.
everyone's had lunch before you get down here today.
pretty much the most gruesome meal I've ever had. I used to, when I was a Pentagon correspondent, I spent a summer going around flying, driving, and shooting lots of American military equipment just to kind of get used to that. So I got to fly a fighter plane and be a gunner in a helicopter and actually steer a cruiser, which was quite an experience. So I remember that fondly. That, of course, would be kind of a little boy's dream. And I must say, a tank is very odd when you fire it. You would think there would be a huge explosion, but it's not. You're inside this huge metal compartment, and all you hear is the recoil of a gun. It's like a giant slingshot. And it's a lot of fun to drive because it pretty well flattens out all the landscape in front of you.
Sounds like maybe that's the most fun you've ever had. What's the most difficult time you've ever had in your travels?
The most difficult time, well, covering the Persian Gulf War was very difficult because, or actually, technically speaking, I was there before the war.
Because the way it was managed?
Yeah, you know, you're sitting there in a hotel in Dhahran, which is a relatively nice oil town. Everybody else is, all the troops and everything are dozens of kilometers away out in the middle of the desert. I mean, you know, I could have wandered out there and that would have been pretty stupid. It was very difficult to get access and to really get a good idea of what was going on. You were totally at the mercy of what various governments and militaries would tell you.
Mm-hmm. Hi, go ahead, please.
Yes, my name is Elisa Willis, and I'm from Gary, Indiana. And I just wanted to say that reading your newspaper, I noticed that it wasn't dealing with like articles dealing with your religion, but it was dealing nationwide with certain situations. And I want to know, why did you set it up like that?
Why we would set it up in dealing with relatively broad kind of nationwide issues? Is that what you're asking me? Well, that's how we hope to attract readers. We have to be different. We have to be different than the newspapers you read every day, or nobody's going to read us. I mean, we can't just be a better version of the Indianapolis Star-Astonisher, you know. So we just try and provide a broader coverage of things that really might be of interest to you in your life.
You know, just for the benefit of people watching on C-SPAN who may think that you are the most voracious newspaper reading students in all of America, I think we should just tell them that, fair enough, that the students here on the Close-Up program are here for a week-long educational program as part of their preparation for this discussion with Mr. Greer. They took a look at the Christian Science Monitor. As we can see by the questions, they took a very careful look at the Christian Science Monitor. And we should thank you. They were complimentary copies that we asked for in preparation for this. So, thanks.
Well, you know, I would be interested in getting a response from this group. Really,
sure. Here's a focus group for you, right?
Just
here.
In general, not just about our newspaper in particular, but newspapers in general. I mean, do you all read newspapers very much at all?
Yeah, if you would raise your hand so we can take a good look at this for people watching on C-SPAN. Raise your hand if you read a newspaper every day. Raise your hand if you're a daily reader of newspapers. That's all right.
It can be all right. You know, I'd rather have the truth than.
Most of you. Okay, how many of you then would say you're weekly, or you know, you don't read it every day, but you read it at least a couple days a week? And how many of you just don't rely on newspapers for your news? You get it from another source, television, radio, or live in a news-free world. Okay, well, you see the majority, there's one person. The majority of people seem to read a paper every day, which I think we've asked this question before. You would be at the higher percentage end of high school students that we've met over the course of the last couple of years who read newspapers as frequently as you do.
Yeah, because, I mean, I've got to say, when I was your age, of course, I would read the sports page and the comics. And
we didn't ask what sections.
And, you know, that was about it. I got to say, I still read the comics quite a bit, so that hasn't gone away. But, you know, if you take anything out of this, maybe just from your visit to the museum here, the one thing I would urge you all to do is to read any newspaper, and not just our newspaper. I heard a comment from one of our higher editors the other day that I thought was a good one about us, and I think that it's something you all could keep in mind, which is we try and show you there's a larger world out there. And the sooner you all realize that there's a larger world out there that's very interesting and has a lot of opportunity for you, the more successful you'll be in your life.
My favorite section is the Bee Lifestyles section. Go ahead, please.
My name's Philip Jones, and I'm from Indianapolis, Indiana. And I'm kind of confused about the purpose of your paper, because you did say it was for publication of the Christian Science religion, and then you said it was to give an accurate description of the news, or so, I can't quote you exactly, but I was just wondering, is it to recruit, if you will, people to the Christian Science religion, and if so, how successful has it been? And then how does your paper compare to other religious papers, maybe like a Catholic or a Free Methodist paper?
Before Mr. Greer answers, can I ask you, Philip, the premise of your question, does it assume that those are contradictory activities?
Oh, no. I just wasn't clear on it, and I just was wondering what the purpose of it was.
No, because, of course, implicitly the church wouldn't be funding a newspaper out of the entirely pure goodness of its heart. I hope I don't get fired for saying that. I mean, you know, implicitly it's for the good of the church as well as for the good of the country or of humankind. And as to the first part of your question, I mean, it's not overtly to recruit people for the church. It's to provide you with an unbiased coverage of news that can provide a little, you know, meaning to you in your life. In that sense, that's something the church can do. That's a good deed. You know, that's worth doing. That's worth doing both for you and for them. So, you know, what you take out of that and go back as to the religion, you know, I don't know. That's for the people who run the churches to talk about, really not for me.
Is the reaction of this audience in any way typical of, I mean, as a group, if I can generalize, they seem to be hung up, you seem to be hung up on the name. And a lot of the questions have reflected that. What does the Christian in Christian Science Monitor mean on an editorial level? Do you find that, you mentioned that focus groups would tell you the name may be a barrier to sales to some segments, but do you get these kinds of letters to the editors or questions in different forums? Do people get hung up on that?
Well, hung up isn't the right word, but they notice it. I mean, this is a very typical response in that regard.
Okay.
I mean, in Washington, of course, and this is good for me too. You forget that I work in Washington where everybody is deadly serious and all that, and so I work in a cocoon in which it's not that surprising. It's relatively well known. You work with people who would have run into it from their clipping services from one thing, you know, for one reason or another, and so you forget about the way it strikes people.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you for another show of hands. How many of you, and be honest on this, had read the Christian Science Monitor before you read it in a classroom context in preparation for this discussion? Raise your hand if you'd read the paper before this. Okay, no one had.
See?
No one had. How many of you had heard of the paper before? Okay, I see a couple people. Okay. Sanborn Regional High School, I think you're next. If I've lost track, I apologize, but is the lunch special today horse fat salami by any strange quirk? Go ahead, Sanborn.
Hi, this is Allie Brulette, and I was just considering the fact that you're a very accomplished individual in the journalism field. I was just wondering what advice you would give to aspiring journalists.
Are you one of those aspiring journalists on the telephone?
I've been thinking about it.
Yeah, okay. We'll get you some career advice.
Go to law school? No. Actually, that's not quite that flip. There are two things that I tend to tell young people who want to go into journalism. One of them is that get as much professional experience as you can, and that would mean volunteering to, say, cover your local high school sports for your local paper. They'll often take stories phoned in from somebody who was there and print them. Any kind of connection with an actual professional organization as opposed to your school newspaper is a huge plus. And the other thing is that you should specialize educationally. You know, journalism school is all well and good. I don't mean to run it down, but many journalistic organizations now look for some kind of a value-added education, like a business reporter has a degree in economics, or a diplomatic reporter has a degree in international relations. So it's a very competitive world, and education can only help you in that regard.
Are you in charge of hiring for the Washington Bureau?
Sadly, no.
No. Okay.
So no resumes, please.
No, I wasn't going to invite those. Hi, go ahead, please.
Hi, my name is Doria Johnson, and I'm from Gary, Indiana. And I wanted to know, why isn't your newspaper really advertised a lot? Because I've never heard of it until today. And what do you do to get it out, like let people know that there is a Christian Science Monitor?
That's good. Can I tape that again so I can send that tape to our marketing department? I can't answer that question. It's not a huge newspaper. We don't have a huge advertising and marketing budget, and it's relatively niche in that regard. We do the best that we can, but obviously, if you all are any indication, we're not doing a great job, at least with the high school students of America. And you do have to remember that high school students are a very tough audience. It's very tough to get your attention about anything. It's very tough to get you to pay attention to, you know, the kind of things that we cover, at least to begin with. So, you know, it doesn't necessarily please me that very few of you have ever heard of us, but on the other hand, it doesn't surprise me that much.
Do you do anything special for this audience? Some publications and newspapers, news weeklies, will have teacher guides that are available to people free of charge or at a nominal price, or have websites that might suggest some ways that you can use things in the classroom. Do you have any activity?
Yes, well actually I did forget to say we are quite popular in university classrooms. We're very good for teaching things, for teaching international relations classes or for political classes. So our circulation actually tends to measurably increase quite a bit during the academic year. And the other thing is that we do have a very active website, which is, I mean, every newspaper has a website now. Everybody says, you know, go into dogandponyshow.com. But the fact of the matter is that the viewership, readership of our website is becoming pretty measurably close to the readership on paper. So that's a lot different for us than it is for a lot of other newspapers who still are vastly a paper product.
What is the website address for anyone interested?
The website address is, again, I hope I get it right because I don't have to type it in, www.csmonitor.com.
Okay, thanks. Hi.
Hi, my name is Renee Jordan and I'm from San Bruno, California. When I was reading through your paper, I noticed the avoidance of violence throughout the articles. I was wondering how you deal with the issue of violence.
Well, we don't cover a lot of violence in that sense. We would cover, which doesn't mean that we would avoid it. We talk about things that are bad that are important. For instance, the last Pulitzer Prize we won 2 years ago was for a young reporter who was covering the war in Bosnia, and he went and found the places where they had buried many of the Muslims that had been summarily killed. And he tromped around and, in essence, kind of, poked around, almost dug up some things just to make sure he found out where he was, and he exposed those. So that is covering violence. That's covering important violence. What we don't cover is the kind of daily violence you get if you watch, say, your local TV news is particularly prone to this, which is, crime and car chases and murders that occur in your town. And, poll after poll shows that people's fears of that kind of thing occurring to them are increasing. And it's, must be partly because of this coverage. We're saturated in that now. Whereas, in fact, the actual crime is decreasing. It's kind of a thing in which many journalistic outlets cover violence for violence sake, and we try and avoid that.
Okay, we're going to go back to Kingston, New Hampshire for another question. Go ahead, please.
Mike Ellis. I just
Mike.
want to say I think we had some of that boarhead salami for lunch today. My question was, what do you feel has been the biggest change in Washington since you've been the bureau chief?
That's an excellent question. The biggest change in Washington, well, there are many more good restaurants. Let me start off with that. I think that Washington is much more diverse than it used to be. And by that, I don't just mean the people are more diverse. It used to, when I first started here, it was still, in 1979, it was the end of the Carter years, it was still pretty much a town with relatively few reporters focused on a relatively few important topics and a relatively few top officials. Now you have, CNN didn't even exist. Now you have many more diverse media organizations, from CNN to Geraldo to Jerry Springer, to there's probably a Cosmopolitan magazine Washington bureau. And because of that, you have an explosion both of coverage and kind of different subjects coming out of Washington every day. So as a reporter, whereas it was my job it was relatively simple in 1979, now it's much more complicated. You have many more choices you have to make in daily coverage, and you have many more competitors.
What about the news business in that same period of time as the student from San Bernardino asked about? What are the changes and what have been either improvements or what has gotten worse in the news industry?
Well, of course, you have...
But I didn't want to assume it's all negative.
Well, let's talk about television. Television increasingly moves into the old role of newspapers, which is to tell you what happened in the world every day. That has, in turn, driven newspapers into doing analysis, into doing long feature pieces, into doing context, which is the kind of thing that we've done for many years. So, to a certain extent, it's driven the whole newspaper industry more towards the way we are.
Hi, go ahead, please.
Hi, my name is Lalinda from San Bruno, California.
Hi.
Has there ever been a story that you've ever regretted reporting because it has drawn controversy or because the efforts of reporting the story were not worth it?
I will tell you about one I feel a little bad about. Some years ago, when I was a Pentagon reporter, a friend who worked for the government gave me a pile of contracts that the old Star Wars program, if you've heard of that, had let. And according to law passed by Congress, any government program that has a big research and development budget has to spend a certain percentage of that on small businesses. You know, and this is to make sure small businesses remain healthy in America. And he gave me a stack of the programs that the Star Wars had let with small businesses. This is a long wind-up to the end of the story. The fact of the matter is that Star Wars program was very complicated, very technical. There weren't too many small businesses really that could handle the kind of things they were doing. So they had a hard time spending that money. And I got one of the contracts. They had a two-person team, a husband and a wife, had gotten $500,000 to study digging a hole in the ground, piling nuclear weapons at the bottom, and blowing stuff into space to use for building space lasers. Which, you know, sounds kind of stupid to me, frankly. And I called, their phone number was on the thing. I called up and I got the woman, the wife. And she admitted, said all this was true. You know, I identified myself as a reporter, but it was clear to me she didn't really know that I was actually going to write a story. I mean, but that's what reporters do. So I felt a little guilty. And then she goes, oh yeah, you know, and actually, well, my husband's a scientist, but I'm a Star Trek novelist, and that's where we got this idea. You know. And they had like quit their jobs to do this contract. It was their livelihood. Now, on the one hand, I felt like this is a complete waste of taxpayer money, you know. But I knew the second I wrote that story, those people were going to lose their jobs and, you know, be like out on the street and in the unemployment line. And that's just what happened. You know, I wrote that story. The next day, the husband called me up, you know, beside himself, and said, look, you know, you sandbagged my wife. We just lost our contract. And I said, I didn't. I told her who I was. It's not my fault if she didn't really realize the consequences. Now, I'd probably still print that story, but I do feel bad about it. So that's a long answer to your question. Sorry.
No, thanks. Hi.
Hi, I'm Demi from San Bruno, California, and I wanted to ask you, as a journalist, why did you decide to go with a small paper such as the Christian Science Monitor instead of a larger paper such as the Washington Post?
Well, to begin with, I got a job there.
They decided to go with you, right?
They decided to go with me. Secondly, obviously there are lots of benefits to working in a place like the Post or the Times. You get huge recognition, you know. You've got power, lots of readers. But on the other hand, it's a grind. It's a daily grind. You don't have much control over what you can do. And a lot of days, it's not much fun. You know, I have a lot of control over what I can do. I get to do things that are important to me. And I get to have a much better time, frankly. And there's much more opportunity. You know, we're an excellent place. This is my recruitment pitch. We're an excellent place for ambitious young journalists to start and get lots of experience, because we'll give you lots of opportunity early in your career to see what you can do. The fellow that won the Pulitzer Prize 2 years ago was basically a news aide at other organizations. Came to us, he was quite young, and he was very good.
Do you compete salary-wise?
Oh, now you're really, really asking the tough questions. Journalism is not a high-paid profession. It's moderately, yeah, actually we do. I think we do compete salary-wise. You know, journalism tops out relatively low. You don't make as much money as a partner in a law firm, but you make as much money as an associate at a law firm up to a certain point. So money's not really an issue for us.
Okay, back to Sanborn Regional High School for another question or comment. Go ahead, please.
My name is Michelle Olson, and I was just wondering what you think the United States should do about Saddam Hussein.
You get to put on your pundit cap for this answer.
Oh, good. This is what I'm really prepared to do. It's tough to answer questions about yourself. I think they should do pretty much just what they're doing. I think that the one thing I think they should do is stop calling him Hitler. because, you know, we build this guy up like he's going to end the world. But look at it from his point of view. You know, he's not getting any younger. And he's sitting there in a country that's got, you know, no money, no food, no weapons really to speak of. He's trying as hard as he can to get some, but he can't really because the U.S. pretty much has him in a box. It's tough for us to keep him in a box, and it's not pretty, but to this point it's worked pretty well.
Hi, go ahead, please.
Hi, my name is Lachey Powers, and I'm from Gary, Indiana. And my question to you, Mr. Greer, is, in the near future, how would you want to see your paper improve?
I'd like to see it double its readership to improve. We strive, for instance, to be tightly written and interesting every day. I'd love to have stories that really punched off the page, you know, that had a little humor and had a little bite to them. That's tough to do in today's modern world on a deadline, so I'd like that. And I'd like to have a little more space. We are a short paper, it's a tabloid, the stories are all relatively short. I think long stories can be very compelling sometimes. I'd like a forum to do that.
Hi, go ahead, please.
I'm Elizabeth Humphrey, and I'm from Anderson, Indiana. And I was wondering, do you ever feel pressured to change the style of your newspaper just to get more readers?
Well, we constantly try and adjust what we're doing to you know, meet the market the best we can. So in that sense, it's an ongoing process. I mean, you'd be foolish to not try and change your style to get readers in that sense, as long as you kind of maintain your bedrock principles, which I think we do.
Time for one more quick question from New Hampshire. If you'd go ahead, please, Sanborn Regional.
Hi, I'm Darcel.
Hi.
I was just wondering what your solution would be to the problem of homelessness in America today.
Homelessness.
Whoa. If I could solve that, I could become a deputy undersecretary of something.
In less than a minute, I think you have to solve that.
Of course, the tough part of the homeless question is that we've almost thrown as much money at it as we can. There are lots of shelters in America now. There are lots of opportunities for people to get food. Many of the homeless that are left are people that really, this sounds callous, but I think it's true, are people that have psychological or addictive problems and don't come in off the street. You know, how you get those people to come in off the street, I don't know. Used to be they made them come in off the street. The police would drag them in. You know, I don't know if that's the solution.
You know, you've seemed more comfortable than some of the journalists we've had as guests in answering questions of opinion on different issues. What gives you the confidence to do that where others have shied away?
I can't answer for them. I've watched a lot of TV and I've noticed that anything you say forcefully sounds good.
Learned your lessons well from watching. Yes. Okay, I want to thank you, Peter Greer, for joining us today.
Thanks very much. It's been fun.
Thanks to all of you as well for your questions and comments. I want to say a special thanks to our friend Danny Genovese and her students up at Sanborn Regional High School in Kingston, New Hampshire. For those of you watching on C-SPAN, we want to thank you again for tuning into this Close-Up at the Newseum discussion and let you know that next week we will have the return of our Student Journalist Roundtable, and we hope that you will choose to join us then. Until then, for all of us at Close-Up and the Newseum, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for watching.